These are sneakers by the American company Nike. In the store, they're priced at $100, but the worker in Vietnam or Indonesia makes around 100 pairs of these each month, only earns $400. So who profits from these sneakers if not the person who made them? Nike itself earns about $5 from each pair, while half of the retail price goes to the retailers, the stores that buy sneakers from the factory and sell them to us. As a result, one group makes the sneakers while another takes the profit. Even Nike's stock is not owned by its regular workers, but by large investment funds whose managers have likely never seen the factory in Vietnam. This doesn't stop them from earning hundreds of times more than those who made the shoes by hand. And Nike is just a small piece of a bigger picture. Today, the 80 wealthiest people in the world control more than half of the world's total wealth. While they own fortunes that could never be spent in a lifetime, over 1 billion people survive on $2 a day. Such inequality has accompanied humanity throughout its history. But only 150 years ago did people begin to fight against it in earnest. The German philosopher Karl Marx led the scientific foundation for this struggle. In the mid-19th century, he wrote Capital, a book that would become an economic bible for millions of minds. In it, Marx explains why people have always oppressed each other, and most importantly, how we could build a society where instead of working for money, people would live for pleasure. But despite the decades that followed, neither the Soviet Union, China, nor anyone else in history has even come close to achieving this communist ideal or creating a society where everyone is equal. Now we'll explain why the grandest experiment to build socialism failed, how communist ideology came about, who founded it, and why communism remains relevant at all times. Most importantly, after this story, you'll understand once and for all, is communism the inevitable future that we should strive for, or a beautiful tale that sounds so logical but is dangerous to believe in? The world of the late 18th century was a remarkable place, particularly its economic center, the British Empire. From African and Indian colonies, cheap raw materials were brought in for the new factories. Banks issued loans to these factories based on the expected future profits, and inventors designed new machines for them. The most advanced weaving factories of the time were created by Richard Arkwright, one of the wealthiest businessmen of the era. In pursuit of profit, he combined a water mill and a spinning machine, where workers produced goods 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, earning half of what carpenters or blacksmiths made. And across the river from Arkwright's main factory, his luxurious mansion with a well-kept garden was being built. Arkwright's factories were a model of efficiency for their time, inspiring many industrialists. One of these was the young Briton Robert Owen. He wanted to emulate Arkwright's success but ensure people worked under humane conditions. To earn the initial capital for his idea, Owen sold his small workshop and took a managerial position at a large factory in Manchester. He quickly rose through the ranks, and by the age of 20, became a co-owner of a business with 500 employees. In Manchester's business circles, Owen gradually became a renowned figure, and in 1799, he attracted investments from several businessmen. With this money, he purchased 4 textile factories in Scotland with 2,000 workers, where he aimed to conduct his experiment. When Owen bought these factories, the working conditions were no better than at Arkwright's. About a third of these workers were children, and the workday was 13 hours. Gradually, Owen reduced the workday from 13 to 10 hours and took an unheard of step, introducing sick leave and pensions. For the children of his workers, Owen built schools and Britain's first kindergartens, understanding that children should first receive an education and only then go to work. He even stopped hiring children under 10, which was unthinkable at the time. Later, Owen pushed this idea in Parliament, turning it into law for all businesses. Despite Owen's factory workers working fewer hours than their competitors, the factory's profits didn't decline. This was because people were more rested, leading to fewer mistakes. Owen's factories grew increasingly popular, attracting visits from British aristocrats and politicians. Later, Owen would tell the famous Russian writer Alexander Herzen that the future Emperor of Russia, Nicholas I, even visited his factory in a small village and invited him to set up a similar enterprise in Russia, though Owen declined. Having changed the lives of people in his factories, Owen wanted to spread this experience across Britain and eventually the world. For 8 years, he traveled around the country giving lectures, proposing to create communities where people coexist as equals. But British entrepreneurs were not particularly inspired by such ideas. So, at 53, Owen, along with his wife and 7 children, decided to leave his conservative country for free and uncharted America, where many Europeans were already heading for a new life. At the time, a religious community of German colonists called Harmony in Indiana was planning to relocate to another state, putting all of their homes and land up for sale. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for, thought Owen. Using his savings on donations, he bought the property, and in 1824 he founded the settlement New Harmony, a colony meant to show the world that people could live in a completely different way. Owen's speeches inspired around 900 people to join his New Harmony. They included intellectuals seeking to build a more perfect society and working families attracted by promises of a better life. People were supposed to move into the commune and work for the benefit of the whole community, growing vegetables, making clothing, furniture, and other goods. What the commune couldn't produce itself, it would buy with money earned from selling its goods. Out of his pocket, Owen himself paid for basic goods and services like medicine or schooling for children. But contrary to expectations of a bright life, the commune attracted a very diverse group of people, many of whom had little interest in chores or construction. After all, if everything was communal, someone else would do it, right? Over time, the hardworking and idealistic members of the community willing to work for the common good grew disillusioned with New Harmony, either founding smaller communes of their own or returning to regular life. Owen himself left the States 3 years after the project began, returning to Britain, effectively acknowledging the failure of his attempt to build a society of the future. Later in his autobiography, Robert Owen's son would write, "A system that rewards everyone equally ultimately demotivates the most experienced, efficient, and hardworking people." Here's the most interesting part. Despite the failure of this experiment, it spread awareness of ideas about a society in which everyone is equal and ordinary workers aren't oppressed, and one person would turn own fragments of ideas into a full doctrine that would become a kind of religion for his followers and forever change the lives of hundreds of millions of people. Well, let me introduce you to Karl Marx. In 1818, while Robert Owen was traveling and lecturing about his vision of a brave new world, a boy named Karl was born in the Prussian city of Trier in what is now Western Germany. He would go on to graduate from Berlin University and then secure a position at one of the country's leading opposition newspapers, the Rheinische Zeitung. Although factories were already being built in Prussia at the time, its economy remained largely agrarian, with peasants making up the bulk of the population. But these new factories required fuel. In Britain, coal quickly became the primary fuel source, but such rich coal deposits had yet to be discovered in Prussia. As a result, wood was used instead, and to ensure its availability, Russian authorities classified the collection of fallen branches as theft. This policy effectively criminalized peasants who had been gathering fallen branches to heat their homes and cook food for centuries. Seeing this, young Karl, in one of his first articles as a journalist, accused landowners of oppressing peasants and labeled the Prussian government a protector of the wealthy. Thanks to such radical publications, the Rheinische Zeitung became famous throughout Prussia. The editorial office received letters from young people who could not reconcile themselves to the injustices of life and wanted to find like-minded people. One of these young men was a fellow named Friedrich, who worked in England at his father's textile factory. Friedrich wrote several articles himself about the plight of the working class in England, criticizing capitalism and describing the appalling living conditions of workers. His article caught Karl's eye, leading to correspondence between the two. As you may have guessed, these young men were Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. In person, Marx and Engels realized their views very much aligned. Moreover, Marx had a PhD in philosophy and a deep theoretical background, while Engels, as a businessman, understood the practicalities of enterprise and had sufficient capital. So, with Engels' financial support, Marx temporarily moved to London, far from Prussia, where he was already facing threats of arrest for his radical writings, and closer to the British Library. In London, Marx began working on a monumental book explaining why inequality ruled the world and how people exploited one another. During his studies, Marx arrived at an entirely new understanding of human history. We are used to dividing history into stages: primitive society, the ancient world, the Middle Ages, the new time, and modern history, just as we were taught in school. In this traditional approach, the transition from one era to the next is explained by a variety of specific events. For example, had the Ottoman Empire not captured Constantinople in the late 15th century, Europeans might have continued trading by land across the Silk Road. But because Byzantium fell, the Spanish and Portuguese sought alternative roads to India, leading to the discovery of the Americas and the beginning of the Age of Exploration, marking the end of the Middle Ages and the start of the new time. But Marx viewed history differently. He argued that it was the economy, not random events, that shaped the course of history. Here's how it works. 10,000 years ago, people lived in small communities where they gathered food and shared it among themselves. Of course, there was no money or private property. But gradually, people learned to domesticate animals, cultivate plants, and divide labor. This allowed communities to grow, and some members began accumulating more resources than others. Now, captives weren't killed, they were enslaved, and as inequality increased, communal living became unsustainable. Thus, humanity gradually transitioned from a primitive society to a slave-holding one. In this new formation, which nurtured states such as ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, and the Roman Empire, slavery played a central role. However, as states grew, maintaining them became more difficult. The Roman Empire, which by the early 2nd century AD controlled all of Western Europe, half of the Middle East, and part of Africa, became increasingly ineffective as it expanded. The cost of maintaining the empire and guarding its borders soared, while new sources of revenue dwindled. A massive bureaucratic apparatus left Rome vulnerable. And when tribes from Eastern Europe and Central Asia began invading Western Europe, the Roman Empire eventually fell under the pressure of these barbarians. The western part of the Roman Empire fragmented into numerous small kingdoms, each ruled by local lords. To hold on to power, these rulers granted land to their vassals, making them feudal lords, while they themselves became kings. The feudal lords not only owned the land, but also the people living on it. It was dangerous and ineffective to keep people as slaves, so instead, they allocated small plots of land to peasants and collected taxes from them in exchange for protection from external threats. This was the transition from slavery to feudalism. 1,000 years later, the bubonic plague swept across Europe, wiping out up to 60% of the population. In England, fields once used to grow wheat and oats were abandoned, and on such large tracts of land, raising sheep became more profitable than growing crops. As a result, English feudal lords gradually shifted from cultivating grain to the more profitable production of wool, and land rental prices rose significantly. In essence, sheep devoured the peasants. The peasants' dependence on their lords weakened as the labor shortage made them more valuable and encouraged former feudal lords to automate work. This led to the invention of the steam engine in Britain, followed by the power loom, both of which drastically improved wool production efficiency and led to the establishment of the first factories. Without field work, the former peasants moved into the cities and became workers in factories, like those of Arkwright, where we began our story. Money, machines, and labor began concentrating in cities, and the development of banks and enterprises undermined the feudal system and gave rise to a new one, capitalism. I summarized thousands of years of history to illustrate how Marx and Engels saw societal development as a matter of changing class structures. Slaves, peasants, and workers on one side, and owners, feudal lords, and capitalists on the other. Each subsequent formation arose not by chance, but because continuing the old way of life became impossible. After all, new technologies and human desires clashed with the established order. Exactly this conflict between productive forces and production relations drives history forward, rather than political, legislative, cultural, or other changes. Yes, these changes are significant, but they are a superstructure, while the economy is the base. And in all eras, the superstructure serves to protect the interests of the ruling classes, keeping the lower classes subdued. Under capitalism, oppression reaches a new level. After all essential means of production, factories, machines, and resources belong to the elites, major businessmen, and politicians. All that remains for workers is labor, without which new goods cannot be created. Remember the Nike sneakers from the start of our story? Out of $100 final price, the worker who made the sneakers only receives a few percent, while the rest goes to those who have never even seen a sewing machine. Marx argues that it is the worker who creates surplus value through labor, but since he does not own the means of production, he receives only a portion of the profit as wages. The rest goes to factory owners who spend money on expanding production and personal luxury consumption. Of course, capitalists aim to earn as much as possible, so they cut their workers'
И Маркс
wages
говорит,
and
что
push them
именно
to work
рабочий
harder.
создает
Eventually,
прибавочную
workers
стоимость
will no
своим
longer be
трудом.
able to
Но
buy
так
all
как
these
средства
goods.
производства
This
ему
means
не
that constant
принадлежат,
prices
то
of
рабочий получает не
overproduction
всю
will
прибыль,
become a
а лишь ее
regular
часть
occurrence,
в виде
making
заработной
ordinary people
платы.
even
Остальное
poorer. Over
уходит
time,
владельцам
the
фабрик,
proletariat,
которые
that is the
тратят деньги
working
на
class,
расширение
will grow
производства
tired
и на
of
личное
enduring this
роскошное
and will unite to
потребление.
fight for their rights. From there, either the capitalists will voluntarily relinquish their wealth, and the proletariat will come to power through democracy, or the ruling capitalist class will be overthrown in a revolution. And after that, well, what does come after that? After the revolution, capitalist resources will be expropriated in favor of the working collectives. In such a society, there will be no private ownership of the means of production, the primary source of oppression, and power will be transferred to the workers. Goods will be produced not for profit, but to ensure everybody has enough, ending the crisis, poverty, and unemployment of market economies. In essence, socialism will arrive. Over time, the role of the state as a coercive instrument will weaken, and technology will make the economy so efficient that people will no longer have to work for wages. At this point, society will begin to transform from socialism to its final stage, communism, and there will be no money, forced labor, or even a state. Marx and Engels expressed all these ideas in the book Capital: Critique of Political Economy. During Marx's lifetime, only the first volume was published, and 2 more volumes were published after his death. It's undeniable that the ideas of capital sound not only appealing, but also logical at first glance. However, capital does not explain precisely how and when society should transition to socialism, let alone communism. The idea of this earthly paradise was so attractive that it quickly captured the imaginations of hundreds of thousands of people. Some of them tried to establish socialism in practice, but for some reason, no country in the world succeeded. And now you will learn why, despite the efforts of countless people, we still live under capitalism. Even before Karl Marx published the first volume of Capital, he and Engels co-authored the Communist Manifesto. To grasp the essence of this document, it's enough to look at its conclusion. Communists openly declare that their goals can only be achieved through the violent overthrow of the entire existing social order. Let the ruling classes tremble before the communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose except their chains. They will gain the whole world. Proletarians of all countries unite. Wait, what about the peaceful transition to socialism? Although Capital mentions such a possibility, Marx believed that the ruling classes, with their immense power and resources, would not relinquish their dominance voluntarily. Thus, the most likely scenario for a transition to socialism is through a revolutionary overthrow of capitalist power. The Manifesto and Marx's Capital were responses to the revolutionary upheavals spreading across Europe in the latter half of the 19th century. Communist ideas found particularly fertile ground in France. In 1817, France was at war with Prussia. The French Emperor Napoleon III was captured, leading to the abolition of the monarchy in Paris. Following a prolonged siege of the city by the German army, the French government, recognizing the inevitability of defeat, agreed to cede part of its territories and pay reparations. In 1871, the French army and the people rose up against their government, which fled to Versailles. Radical French socialists, with the support of the National Guard, established the Paris Commune, a governing body where all officials were elected by the people and could be recalled at any time. The Commune planned social reforms, including reducing the workday to 10 hours and freezing payments like rent and loan debts. Naturally, the political elites of France, Russia, and other European nations saw this as a serious threat of spreading socialism. Therefore, within 2 months, the exiled French government, in alliance with its recent enemy Prussia, re-entered Paris and brutally crushed the Commune, restoring their power. Yet, this did not halt the spread of communism across Europe. By the late 1880s, the Socialist Party of Germany had garnered 1/5 of the vote in the 1890s Reichstag elections, more than any other party. Meanwhile, in neighboring France and Italy, communists had won elections in several municipalities. Socialist parties even emerged in Russia, where workers made up only 15% of the population. One of the prominent parties, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, proposed two paths for Russia's development. One faction of the party advocated for strict candidate selection and gradual socialist reforms. The other, led by Vladimir Lenin, insisted on a revolution to overthrow the monarchy. Ultimately, the majority of the party chose the revolutionary path and formed their own faction, the Bolsheviks. However, neither Emperor Nicholas II nor his inner circle believed in the possibility of a communist revolution. They viewed the revolutionaries as a minor nuisance and planned to suppress protests with targeted repressions. Perhaps the socialists would not have succeeded if Nicholas II had not decided to enter World War I. Instead of fostering patriotism and national unity among peasants and workers, the war brought food shortages, high inflation, and growing discontent with the monarchy. By the third year of the war, in February 1917, the situation had escalated to the point that workers and soldiers took to the streets of Petrograd. Under the influence of revolutionaries, their slogans shifted from peace and bread to all power to the Soviets and down with the autocracy. Thus began the February Revolution, which led to the abdication of Nicholas II and the transfer of power to the Provisional Committee of the State Duma, composed mostly of liberal political leaders. For instance, Mikhail Rodzyanko, head of the Octobus Party, represented the interests of major landowners and entrepreneurs. Simultaneously, another body emerged, the Councils of Workers and Soldiers' Deputies. Initially, the councils served as a platform for making demands and discussing pressing issues of the proletariat, a democratic response to the revolution. This means that power shifted from the monarch to moderate liberals and socialists, yet Russia was still engaged in war, and the lives of ordinary workers and peasants remained largely unchanged after the emperor's abdication. At this moment, the Bolsheviks realized that the time was ripe for seizing power. In April 1917, Lenin returned from exile and delivered a speech at the main building of the Soviets in Petrograd, harshly criticizing the war, which he argued served the interests of the bourgeoisie rather than the common people. Lenin asserted that capitalism inevitably leads to wars. In his view, under capitalism, entire sectors of the economy are monopolized by financial oligarchies, a close alliance of banks and major corporations. The owners of these companies impose their interests on governments, turning the state into a tool for achieving capitalist goals. This is why the provisional government, which included major businessmen and political elites, supported the continuation of the war and was in no hurry to help peasants and workers. Lenin called for a new socialist revolution to finally establish the power of the people. To convey the complex theory of Marxism-Leninism to the masses, the Bolsheviks adapted Lenin's April thesis into memorable and easily understood slogans. The dictatorship of the proletariat was encapsulated in the bold phrase, "All power to the Soviets." The thesis on the capitalist nature of war was simplified to the slogan, "Peace to the peoples." The idea of labor exploitation and alienation was reformulated as factories to the workers, and given Russia's largely agrarian population, another slogan was added, "Land to the peasants." Now the people knew whom to support, and the Bolsheviks quickly gained popularity. In October 1917, the provisional government was arrested, and on the ruins of the Russian Empire, the Bolsheviks began the most famous and large-scale experiment in building socialism. In its 70 years of existence, the Soviet Union achieved incredible results. An agrarian country became the center of one of the world's strongest economies. The Soviet army defeated fascism, Soviet scientists sent the first human into space, and Soviet leaders established a system of free education and healthcare. Yet despite all these achievements, the USSR never managed to build the socialism Marx had envisioned, let alone communism. Even though factories and industries were state-owned, real democracy was absent and corruption and bureaucracy persisted. So why did the attempt to build socialism in the largest power of the 20th century fail? Modern communists explain it this way. Marx showed that the revolution should occur in advanced capitalist countries with broad working class. Such countries already had a developed economy capable of providing a high standard of living for everyone. It was there that the conflict between workers and capitalists was most acute. In practice, however, the large-scale revolution took place in a country where the transition from feudalism to capitalism was not yet complete. The main driving force of the revolution in the Russian Empire was not the conscious and educated working class, but the peasants and the military. So what, you might ask? Why does it matter who organized the revolution? The point is that, according to Marx, the party should merely guide the direction of development and help workers fight against the remnants of capitalism. Over time, its power should fade away, but from the very start of the Soviet Union, the Communist Party only grew stronger. Officials of various levels gained access to apartments, cars, villas, and scarce goods unavailable to ordinary people. Naturally, no one in the upper echelons wanted to lose these privileges, and power remained in the hands of a narrow circle. Thus, just like under capitalism, the Soviet state failed to rid itself of bourgeois remnants and ultimately collapsed. The Soviet Union is a prime example, but not a unique one. Everywhere communists came to power, from China to Cuba, the fighters for communist ideas were soon replaced by the same kinds of people as everywhere else. Yes, they probably wanted to make the world a better place, but even more so, they wanted to drive nice cars, live in big houses, and take their children to the seaside a few times a year.
Мне нужен магнитофон заграничный, американский или немецкий.
Вот есть очень хороший, отечественный.
Спасибо, отечественный подойдет.
This is because the desire to gain as many benefits as possible while expending as few resources as possible is the national formula of world order that has
Вот
driven
есть очень
humanity
хороший,
forward for
отечественный.
millennia.
Спасибо,
Thanks to
отечественный
this
подойдет.
drive, people invented new technologies and created great works that transformed our consumption. However, let's be honest, their primary motivation was the desire for wealth and recognition. Therefore,
Благодаря ей люди изобретали новые технологии и основывали крупнейшие компании, которые меняли наше потребление. Однако, их основным мотивом было, давайте говорить честно, желание богатства и признания, а потому попытка насильно уравнять людей в доходах и уровне жизни без учета их стараний, талантов и труда обречена на провал. Помните новую гармонию Оуэна? Зачем напрягаться, если результат делится на всех? И даже самые сознательные, увидев, как другие работают спустя рукава, сами махнут рукой на такую справедливость.
Based on public needs. How this would work was not detailed by Marx, so it was left to the Soviets to figure out how to organize a planned economy. Through planning, the resources of the former Russian Empire were channeled into rapid industrialization, transforming the USSR from a backward agrarian state into an industrial power capable of defending against external threats. After the end of World War II, however, the Soviet economy became increasingly complex. It wasn't just about building large factories and infrastructure, it was about producing and distributing a vast variety of goods. The inability to account for the needs of millions led to overproduction of some goods and shortages of others. The very flaw of capitalism criticized by Marx persisted in a planned economy. The role of the invisible hand of the market, which eliminates inefficient production and drives progress, was taken over by the State Planning Committee, where officials decided what should and shouldn't be produced. As a result, innovative Soviet inventors who could have made significant contributions to the country's economy did not receive the green light. For example, in 1951, a group of engineers led by Sergei Lebedev developed the first Soviet computer only 6 years after the US. However, the party leadership deemed this direction unpromising and denied support. Consequently, Soviet computer technology did not achieve widespread use, and the modern market was filled with American and Asian computers. Another striking example is the invention of the first prototype mobile phone, presented by Soviet engineer Leonid Kuprianovich in 1958. The support story was the same as with the Soviet computer. The difference is that the first mobile phone would be released to the market by the American company Motorola a full 15 years later. These small stories show that the market elements provide more flexible mechanism for supply and demand, helping to win global competition and create a stronger economy. Modern communists might smirk and say that today, most goods and services in the world are distributed through multinational corporations operating within a planned economy. Huge corporations like General Motors, British Petroleum, and Amazon serve the entire world, distributing products among their subsidiaries at planned prices and functioning very efficiently. So why can't the states transition to a planned economic format? That's because dear communists forget that these multinational corporations do not exist in a vacuum but operate in a competitive market environment. Because of this, they are forced to constantly refine management processes, regularly adjust their plans, and seek ways to improve profitability. And the economy of any modern state is not devoid of planning. Just look at the national budget, which is prepared years in advance. So we're left with the most important question. If socialism cannot be achieved due to human self-interest and the planned economy without market elements is doomed to fail, why do so many people continue to follow Marx's teachings even though it has been 150 years since Das Kapital was published and 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union? Despite failures set in practice, millions of people still support communism. For example, recent polls in the UK show that a third of people aged 18 to 34 support communist ideas. The same statistics can be seen in the United States, where a third of the younger population views communism positively. In fact, this is easy to explain. The lower the average standard of living, the more likely people are to support egalitarian policies. Many today consider the standard of living to be lower than it was in the 1970s and 1980s, and this applies in countries around the world. This is happening almost everywhere in the world. That's why people turn to the appealing ideology of communism, which promises a prosperous life for everyone.
И на самом деле это очень легко объяснить, ведь чем ниже средний уровень жизни, тем более вероятно, что люди будут голосовать за уравниловку. А сегодня этот уровень жизни многие оценивают ниже, чем, к примеру, в 70-е и 80-е. И это касается не только России.
This sounds quite logical, but the problem is that not all fantasies become reality. For example, a perpetual motion machine could revolutionize our world, but the very concept violates the fundamental laws of physics. The same goes for communism. Its principles conflict with the basic laws of human nature and society. The idea that millions of people would work not for their own benefit, but for the common good sounds beautiful, but does not hold up in practice. Attempts to forcibly build communism lead to suppression of freedom, repression, and economic decline. For instance, in 1959, Soviet scientist Anatoly Kitov sent a letter to Nikita Khrushchev proposing the implementation of a computer management system in the Soviet economy, a groundbreaking idea that warranted closer examination. Instead, Kitov was expelled from the Communist Party for criticizing management methods. The party elite simply feared that computers could turn everything upside down, make bureaucrats obsolete, and strip them of their high status. As a result, the kind of computer network Kitov proposed began operating in the West 10 years later, and the USSR fell hopelessly behind the US in the development of computer technology. Fine, perhaps communism won't come now, but far in the future. Maybe robotization, artificial intelligence, and alternative energy sources will replace human labor, and supercomputers will help create a planned economy that can account for every individual's needs. In that case, communism might inevitably emerge in 500, 1,000, or even 10,000 years. But scientific progress does not solve the fundamental problems of this ideology. Take, for example, a chessboard. It only has 64 squares and 32 pieces. It seems like calculating all possible moves on such a limited field would be simple, yet no modern computer can do this today. There are just too many possible chess games. Now consider the economy of a single country, which is not made up of 64 squares, but of tens of millions of people with their own needs. Attempting to predict their actions and desires seems like an unsolvable task in theory. In the end, communism is a bright and appealing ideology that we all want to believe in, but it has little in common with real life and is more like a religion than science. If you don't believe me, just open the most reputable scientific economic journals in the world. The overwhelming majority of articles focus not on the problems of worker exploitation and surplus value appropriation by capitalists, but on consumer behavior in the market, monetary policy nuances, and trade relationship analysis. It's not because communists are excluded from science, but because their arguments often lack mathematical formalization. Instead, communists often engage in philosophical discussions and use of political slogans. Today, there are many different viewpoints in the theory of political economy on how society will develop. For example, the well-known economist Joseph Schumpeter also believed that socialism was inevitable, but argued that the transition would not happen through revolution, but through the gradual evolution of capitalism. He believed that the consistent monopolization of the global economy and the bureaucratization of large corporations would eventually lead to a situation where all property would either be state-owned or corporate-owned. However, it is clear that this evolution would take place slowly over the course of hundreds of years. And personally, you have a choice. You can believe that sooner or later there will be peace on earth and that someone will come and grant you a prosperous life just because you deserve it. You can blame those who are richer than you, claiming they are simply lucky and that you are not among them, because you refuse to participate in this rat race. Yes, it's easy to do all of this, but it won't change your life in the slightest. Instead of following ideologies that promise an illusionary future and engaging in pointless arguments online, think about what useful things you can do for your community and how you can improve your education and income. This will be much more productive, and most importantly, it will help move both you and society as a whole to a new stage of development.